each word cutting deeper into her soul. She was only 10 years old, yet she was already painfully aware of how different she was from the other kids. While her classmates had normal necks, hers seemed to stretch on forever, like a twisted joke played by nature. No one ever let her forget it. Her classmates stood in a circle around her, pointing and laughing. Zara's face flushed bright red as she tried to shrink into herself, wishing she could disappear. Her mother had always told her that her long neck was special, something that made her unique. But how could anyone see that when everyone around her just mocked her? "Zara!" one of the girls yelled. "Can you reach the top shelf with that thing? How tall are you anyway? 10 feet." Zara's hands balled into fists at her sides. She didn't want to cry. She didn't want to show them how much their words hurt. But it was hard. So hard. She forced herself to look at the ground, hoping they would stop. But they didn't. It was then that the bell rang, signaling the end of recess. The kids scattered to their classrooms, but Zara didn't move. She stood there for a long moment, staring at the ground, her neck still feeling like the only thing people could see about her. Her classmates' cruel laughter lingered in her ears as she walked slowly to class, her head down, trying to keep it from growing any longer. But then a voice broke through the noise in her head. "Zara, wait up!" It was Darlington, a quiet boy from her class who always kept to himself. He wasn't like the others. He didn't laugh at her, and that alone made him seem like a friend. She turned to face him, surprised to see him coming towards her with a soft smile on his face. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice gentle, as if he already knew the answer. Zara's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back quickly. She didn't want Darlington to see her cry. "Not here, not now." "I'm fine," she whispered, trying to hold back her emotions. "It's nothing." But Darlington didn't believe her. He stepped closer, his expression serious. "Don't listen to them," he said softly, his hand resting on her shoulder. "You're more than just your neck. You're a lot more than they'll ever understand." Zara nodded, but it didn't help. His words were kind, but the hurt still burned deep inside her. The day dragged on in a blur, the pain of the morning's teasing weighing heavily on her heart. But as the bell rang for the end of the school day, something strange happened. When Zara stepped outside, she found the crowd of students still gathered around. The usual group of bullies was there, but there was a new boy with them, someone Zara hadn't seen before. He was tall, with dark eyes that looked like they could see straight through her. And there was something about him, something in his gaze, that made Zara feel uneasy. The boy stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as they locked onto Zara's long neck. "Hey, everyone!" he called, his voice sharp and confident. "Look at this! The giraffe girl is back!" Zara's stomach churned, but what happened next made her heart stop. The boy smirked, his eyes flashing with something dark. "You should be ashamed of yourself," he sneered. "Everyone here knows that you're just weird." The other kids laughed, But the boy's words hit Zara harder than any joke. He was different from the others. He was crueler. And for the first time, Zara felt a deep, gnawing fear in the pit of her stomach. She turned to leave, but before she could, the boy grabbed her by the arm. "Where do you think you're going?" he asked, his grip tightening. Zara's mind raced. She wanted to scream, to fight back, but she was frozen. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, it stopped. A figure stepped out from the crowd, tall and commanding. It was Darlington. His face was filled with determination, his eyes locked on the new boy, and without a word he pushed the boy away from Zara. "Let her go," Darlington said, his voice cold. The boy looked startled, but then smirked again, stepping back. "What's it to you?" he asked, sneering. Darlington didn't answer. Instead, he stood there, waiting, his body tense. And the boy, realizing he was outnumbered, slowly backed away, turning and disappearing into the crowd. Zara stood there, heart pounding, feeling the weight of everything that had just happened. Darlington didn't say anything more. He just turned and walked away, leaving Zara to stand there, her emotions swirling in a storm of confusion, anger, and fear. But that was just the beginning. Zara stood in the schoolyard, watching Darlington walk away. The boy was gone, but the sting of his words still echoed in her ears. Little did she know, something big was about to happen, and Zara's life would never be the same again. Zara spent the night turning everything over in her head. The way the new boy had looked at her, the mocking tone in his voice, everything felt so strange. Even though Darlington had stepped in, it didn't erase the feeling that something was coming, something darker than the teasing she had always endured. The next day at school, Zara found it hard to focus. Every time she passed a mirror or glanced at her reflection, she saw her long neck staring back at her, like it was the only thing anyone ever saw. The teasing was worse than before, not just from the kids in her class, but from those she had never spoken to, the ones who only knew her by the rumors that circulated about her strange appearance. "Look at Zara," they whispered as she passed by. "I bet she can see the world from a mile away with that neck." Zara's heart sank. It felt like she was trapped in a world where no one could see her for who she truly was. The taunts, the laughter, it all blurred together like a constant hum in her ears. At lunch, she sat alone, pushing her food around on her tray. Darlington usually sat with her, but today he was distant, sitting at a different table, talking to a group of boys Zara didn't recognize. She felt a pang of loneliness, the kind that only grew deeper with each passing moment. "Hey, Zara!" a voice called out suddenly, pulling her from her thoughts. She looked up to see Darlington standing near her table, his hands shoved in his pockets, his expression a little awkward. "Hey!" Zara replied softly, giving him a weak smile. He hesitated, glancing around before sitting down beside her. "I'm sorry for yesterday," he said, his voice quiet. "I didn't mean to leave you alone with him." Zara shook her head, feeling her face flush. "It's not your fault," she said quickly. You didn't have to step in. I can handle myself. Darlington looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing her words. I don't know, he finally said, his voice low. I don't like how they treat you. And that guy, he's trouble. He's not like the other kids. Zara nodded slowly, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her tray. She had noticed something off about him too, something that made her feel uneasy. There was a darkness in his eyes, something that went beyond the typical schoolyard teasing. But what could she do? She was just a kid, and he was older, bigger, and crueler than anyone she had ever met. I don't want to deal with him anymore, Zara muttered, barely above a whisper. I wish I could just disappear. Sometimes I think it would be better if I didn't have this neck. The words slipped out before she could stop them, and once they were out, she immediately regretted it. She hated herself for feeling that way, but she couldn't help it. The teasing, the whispers, the way everyone made her feel different. It all wore her down. Darlington didn't say anything for a moment, but when he finally spoke, his words surprised her. You know, he said thoughtfully, there are people in this world who would kill to have what you have. Not your neck, but your strength. You're different, Zara. You stand out, even if people don't see it. You don't need to shrink yourself. Zara looked at him, a bit stunned. What do you mean? Darlington shrugged, his gaze distant. You might not see it now, but one day your neck is going to be the thing that makes you stand out in a big way. People like you, Zara, have the power to change the world. Zara wanted to believe him, she really did. But the world had never made her feel special. It had made her feel like an outsider, a joke. The rest of the day passed in a blur of whispered comments, cold stares, and more teasing. Zara couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something was coming. The new boy had made it clear that he wasn't done with her yet. Later that night, as Zara lay in bed, she heard a knock at the window. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, almost rhythmic. Thump, thump, thump. She got up, heart pounding in her chest. Who could be knocking at her window at this hour? Hesitantly, she pulled back the curtain and peered out into the darkness. There, standing in the yard, was the new boy. His eyes were fixed on her window, and there was an almost predatory gleam in his gaze. Zara's heart raced, and for a split second she considered calling out for her parents, but something about his presence made her feel frozen in place. He raised his hand and waved slowly, as if mocking her. Then, without another word, he turned and disappeared into the shadows of the night.